Hello, all the crazy people out there. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games, and welcome back to Getting Started in GameMaker. So, in the last one of these videos, I talked about getting started with code, writing code for the first time, for those of you who may never have seen it before. We got ourselves to a state where we can do things like have this player character, smiley face guy, walk around on the screen. And that's alright, but it is very, like, programmer art, which is basically game dev slang for if you ask someone who's not an artist to draw a picture, this is about what you'd expect. So today I think we'll actually take a few minutes to work with sprites and tiles and graphics and some other visual aspects of your game. And I'll talk about how you can manipulate all this through code later on, but first let's actually talk about what you can do to add sprites to your game. So previously, I used the GameMaker sprite editor to draw this, and it's basically a slightly more advanced version of Microsoft Paint. And if you want a really fast way to make some temporary graphics like this for your game, it serves its purpose pretty well. But if you want to actually draw a sprite, you probably might want to import your sprites from somewhere else. How exactly you do that is kind of up to you. You can use a dedicated pixel art software like Sprite or a painting software like Krita or something if you want to draw your sprites that way. You can also go and check on websites such as itch.io. And if you've never been here before, itch.io is a wonderful indie game dev oriented website where you can do things like host your games, sell your games, give your games away for free. You can also distribute game assets like this, so just like collections of sprites and stuff. I'm just going to search for sprites, and I'm just going to click on the first result. And preferably this is going to be something you can download for free so that you can just, if you're following this video, download it and try it out. This looks like it should work fairly well. I don't know who this person is. They just happened to come up when I as the first result when I searched. I'm going to let's open that folder, and I can go and see there's going to be a bunch of subfolders for things like entities. That sounds like, I don't know, characters or something like that. So if I were to open this up. Okay, we have like a knight character. That's fine. Let's go and extract this. And that's going to take a minute. Entities, NPCs, knight, idle. So to get this into GameMaker, we can either just go and like click import, and we can open up the file finder. That's kind of a pain. What we can also do is we can just take our sprite file, we can just drag it from Windows Explorer, from the File Explorer into the GameMaker IDE and say yes. So this knight character here is basically a 4-frame animation. It looks like it's just going to be like an idle, like bob up and down animation. This came in as a single sprite, which isn't really what we want. You have a couple choices here. You can either manually on your own just cut this up into 4 pieces, which I don't really want to do because that'll take a lot of time. You can go into GameMaker Sprite Editor and you can say... don't ask me why that was so hard to find. Convert to frames over here. And this is a little utility which you can use to chop up sequences of sprites in GameMaker into basically different frames. So if I say the number of frames is going to be 4, the number of frames per row is going to be 4. Frame width is 32, frame height is 32. That looks fine. You can also specify some like frame offsets and pixels or padding between frames and pixels if you'd like. And I'm just going to say convert, and that is going to replace our one single image with 4 sprite frames into 4 sub images, which we can GameMaker will identify this as different frames of the same animation. So the other thing you can do, and I'm going to go and get rid of that and we can do this all over again, is if your sprite file in the File Explorer is named in a particular way, such as if I were to take this this sprite and if I were to append the suffix underscore strip4 to the end of it. If your sprites have a suffix like this, when you drag it into GameMaker or when you otherwise try to load your sprite into GameMaker, GameMaker will automatically recognize that and it will cut your sprite into 4 subimages like this without you really having to do anything else yourself. This is very handy. A lot of the times when you're working with a sprite, when you draw a sprite or when you get a sprite from like an artist or something like that, it'll come in as a sequence like this in a linear sequence of images like that, and it won't be like separate files for each frame, and if it did, that would honestly probably be way more of a pain to deal with. If you load your sprite into GameMaker, and if you just suffix it with _strip whatever, then GameMaker will automatically chop it up for you. Each of the frames is going to need to be like the same size. So in my case, each of these frames are 32 pixels. The total image is 128 pixels wide. If I were to call this like strip 6 or something like that, GameMaker would not let me import this. It's going to warn me that a image size of 128 wide can't be split into 6 equal frames. It apparently will import it, but it won't chop it up for me. All right, good to know. So just be aware of that. 32 by 32 is an extremely common size for character sprites in most GameMaker games. You can, of course, go bigger than that if you want higher resolution art. You can, of course, go smaller than that if you want to make it look like your game is running, like, with the original Game Boy, like, visual style or something like that. But that is going to be importing sprites into GameMaker. By the way, there's a couple different ways you can get sprites into GameMaker. You can drag and drop them from the file explorer like I did, and it'll automatically be imported. You can click the import sprite button, and it will open up a file finder, which will allow you to load a sprite into GameMaker. You can also go and go into the sprite editor itself and say import images, and you can open up basically the same file finder. There's like 3 or 4 different ways to get sprites into GameMaker. You can also export to PNG if you happen to want to go the other way. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the sprite editor. It's pretty basic. If you've ever used any other image editing software ever, you probably know what most of these do. And in any case, usually when you're doing graphics in your game, you're going to be authoring them in some external software like Sprite or Photoshop or Critter or something, and then bringing them into GameMaker. And you're not going to spend a ton of time in GameMaker sprite editor. That's actually a subject of fairly heated debate within the GameMaker community, is like, is it even worth GameMaker having a sprite editor at all? I will defend its existence because I think it's useful to be able to draw stuff like basically this once in a while, but I'm not going to go quite as far as to say it's a good image editor or anything like that. So before we go any farther, I want to talk a little bit about some of the more I guess I might call them secondary features of the GameMaker sprite editor. So, if you have a sprite with multiple frames like this, you can click and drag on the little timeline down at the bottom, and you can, like, scroll through them. You can also just play the animation by clicking the play button down there. And this is a little bit fast. This animation is playing at 30 frames per second, which is rather a lot faster than I think it was really intended to be. And if you'd like to slow that down, you can go to the FPS text input over here in the top left, and we can decrease this from, say, 30 to maybe 10 or something like that. And now if I were to play this animation, that's still a little bit fast. Let's go to like 8 maybe? 6? I have not like planned out how I was going to like what sprites I was going to use in this video. Alright, 6 FPS looks alright. We can see that you're doing a little like bounce up and down on your knees out of boredom or something like that, because this was an idle animation when I downloaded it after all. Anyway, that's animation speed. This will have some bearing on how the animation is played in the game. We'll get back to that. There's also the sprite origin, and the sprite origin is going to define the point where the sprite is drawn relative to whenever you when you assign it to an object, or if you were to draw a sprite manually or something like that. And by default, GameMaker will have you defaulting your sprite origins to the top left. It is common to want to set the sprite origin to something like the middle center, or perhaps the bottom center, especially for characters. You'll want to set your sprite origin to bottom center. You could also set it to anywhere else. The sprite origin will affect where your sprite is drawn relative to from your object's position. It will also affect things like where the point that the sprite is rotated around if you were to rotate it, or the point that the sprite is scaled around if you were to scale it up and down. And you can select the point by clicking and dragging this little crosshair thing in the sprite editor. You can type in the coordinates of the origin if you'd like, or you can use this little drop down in the upper right corner to set the sprite origin to some exact point in this list. All right. Again, traditionally for like characters and players and enemies and that kind of thing, you would set your sprite origin to like the bottom center. So I guess I'll do that now. Moving on from that, if I go over to the side here, we have some advanced texture settings. These are settings which will affect how your sprites are organized within the game when the GameMaker asset compiler runs. This isn't something you need to worry about unless you have like a lot of sprites and you need to organize them in some way. Collision mask. This is for collision detection with sprites. I will make a separate video on collision detection in GameMaker later, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. And 9 slice. 9 slices are interesting. These are usually for if you want a user interface sprite to be able to be stretched and like extended or repeated in interesting ways. I'm not going to worry about that now either. 9 slices are a lot of fun. You can do some really cool things with them, but I don't think that is quite relevant to what we're going to do now. So if we were to have our sprites actually do something in the game, I'm just going to go and click and drag spr_character to assign the sprite to this player object over here. And if I were to run the game now, we're going to have a small picture of that knight guy just bouncing up and down out of boredom as he walks around left, right, up and down. There's a few things that you might think could be improved about this the situation. For one, it's very small. And this is 32. This is a 32 by 32 sprite. It is not going to be scaled up by default when you run your game, and you might want to do something about that. For another thing, you're not really moving left or right. I mean, you're not turning left or right when I move left or right, which is something that you often want characters to do in games when you move around. And there's a few other things. Animation speed. You might want to be able to change the animation speed of a character sprite or some other sprite. You might want to switch out your character sprite for some other sprite, like when you turn to face another direction or something like that. So let's get started here. So if I open up the create event of obj_player, I apparently still have some code in there from when I was messing around with variables in the last video. So let's get rid of that. So I believe I mentioned that GameMaker has a couple dozen built-in variables for every object, which will define things like its sprite information or its position information or things like that. And let's start out by saying image x scale equals 2 and image y scale equals 2. So image x scale and y scale are going to be variables which define well, you can probably guess that it affects the scale of the sprite. So, by default, of course, these will be 1. If we set this to 2, the sprites will be twice as big when they are drawn automatically by GameMaker. And that's going to, that's actually still a little bit smaller than I was hoping it would be. So let me go and set that to 4 instead. Double the size again, and we now have a slightly bigger image. If you want every sprite in your game, or every sprite in your game world, I should say, to be scaled up by a certain amount, there are better ways to do that by messing with like the size of the camera and the viewport and things of that nature. But the main thing I'm trying to accomplish here is to make this sprite big enough that you can actually see it. So I'm just going to use the x scale and y scale variables for this. If you ever reach the point where you're considering just setting the x scale and y scale of every object in your game to 4, then that's probably a sign that you should actually work with like the camera and viewport settings to sort of zoom in on your game world instead. But that's a whole very long video on its own. So next, if you want your sprite to look left or right when you move around, we can perhaps go into, let me full screen this so there's more space. Go into our step event, and when we walk around, when we check the A or the D keys to move left or right, in addition to increasing your position on the screen, and you know what? Because 2 pixels per step feels rather slow, let me just increase that to 4 as well. We can say image x scale, and when you're moving to the right, you'll want that to be a, and I'll explain this in a moment, but when we're moving to the right, image x scale can be 4. When we're moving to the left, so when we're moving in the negative direction on the x-axis, image x scale can be -4. And if I were to make this change, if I move to the left, we're going to face that direction. If I move right, we're going to face that direction. And this is a very simple, quick, and dirty way of just having your character change direction when you're moving left and right on the screen. This is the sort of thing that, at first glance, it seems too simplistic to actually work in an actual game. But a lot of games will actually do this if a character doesn't have separate left and right sprites, and if the sprite is just mirrored horizontally when you move left and right, then there's no point in having separate sprites or separate animations or separate anything when you're moving left and right. You might as well just mirror it horizontally like this by setting the image x scale to the negative. You can, of course, swap out your character sprite when you're moving in different directions, and I will get to that in a few moments. But first, let me talk a little bit about the image speed. I did not mean to close that tab. Let me just go back to the create event. Also, I didn't say it out loud, but once again, the create event is going to contain the code that runs when the instance is created. In this case, which runs when the game starts because the instance is created with the room. And the step event is going to contain code that runs every frame. So some more built-in variables of GameMaker that pertain to sprites and instances. We have image speed and image index. Image speed is going to contain the speed of the animation. By default, it's going to be 1. And that means that the speed of the sprite animations is going to advance at exactly this speed. So 6 frames per second, with each frame lasting 183 milliseconds. If you'd like to make your character stop animating altogether, you can set image speed to 0, and that will cause your sprite to just not automatically animate. And the way that default sprite animations for GameMaker instances work is that image index is another built-in variable, which is going to contain basically the index of the sprite frame, which is currently being drawn. And this number will automatically be increased every step of the game based on image speed and based on the speed defined in the GameMaker sprite editor. And you can reference image index to do whatever you'd like. You can also set it to something if you'd like to specifically set the image index of a sprite to a specific frame, the first frame or the last frame or something like that. And you can use all this to control the animation properties of a sprite. I'm going to mostly focus on image speed because I think that's more interesting. So by default, I said it's going to be 1. If you set it to 2, the sprite will animate twice as fast as was defined by the speed in the sprite editor. If you set it to 0.5, the sprite will animate at half speed. So this is really a multiplier on the speed that was defined in the sprite editor. I'm going to, I think, set it to 0 for now. And in the step event, let's say in the step event, I can say image speed equals 1. And I'm just going to do this no matter which direction we're moving in. So up, down, left, or right. And this will have our character start out not animating, but when I start to move, you will start animating. This will have the problem of when I stop moving, you will keep animating because I never told you to stop. So you can either chain all these together in like a big if-else and have like the final else at the end set image speed to 0. You can set image speed to 0 like by default before you actually do any keyboard checks. And this will have our character have our image animation speed set to some number when we're moving around, but come to our animation will stop when we stop moving. If you'd like to go a step farther than that, you can also have our the image index reset when you stop moving, so that like you reset to the first frame of the animation. But I think that's going to be a task which I'm going to assign for your homework or something like that. And what else did I want to say? I think that's it for image speed. So lastly, to manipulate the sprite of an object itself, or the sprite of an instance itself, I should say, there is a variable which is pretty important. It's going to be sprite index. And this is going to be a variable which doesn't contain like a number like 1, 2, 3 or whatever, but it is going to contain a reference to our character sprite itself. So assets in GameMaker can be treated as values in expressions like this, but you can use references to assets like sprites or objects or rooms or whatever in like your code itself. And you can use this to change the sprite that's associated with an object. To start out, let's go back to the step event, and instead of doing something when like you move around, how about if I say if keyboard check pressed. So when you press the, I don't know, tab key, I don't think I'm using anything for that yet. When you press the tab key, I can say sprite index equals SPR player. So if I hit the tab key, we're going to turn into whatever that is. It's not showing it on my mouse over. That's cool. And if I want to reset it, I can say something like if keyboard check pressed VK underscore, I don't know, space or something like that. I can set the sprite index to SPR underscore character. And this is going to allow me to do all the things that I could before, so walking around, animating, or something like that. If I hit the tab key, we're going to change to this. We have our, basically, we're being reflected over the horizontal axis when I move left and right. And here we can actually see the effect of the sprite origin, which I guess I might as well just call attention to. So you can see that the sprite is kind of jumping around when I move left and right, and that's because the sprite origin is set to this corner here where my mouse cursor is, and where my mouse cursor is right now is actually where the sprite is located in the room, and the sprite origin is in the upper left corner, so the smiley face is gonna like start here, and it's gonna be drawn from this point. If I were to move left, then our horizontal scale is going to be set to -4 instead of positive, and that means that when we flip our sprite horizontally, it's going to be flipped around that corner, which means that once again the object is where my mouse cursor is, but because the sprite is being drawn with a negative scale, it's going to be going in the other direction instead. This is why it is often useful to set your sprite origin to somewhere in the center of the sprite like this. The center bottom, like I said, is tradition for reasons which I won't get into right now. Anyway, this does also become relevant if you want to rotate your sprite, and if you want to rotate your sprite, you probably want to set the sprite origin to either the middle center, so that it rotates around the center, or some other point of rotation if you have some other desired point of rotation. Anyway, let me go and actually move on to doing something else with character sprites. So what other character sprites do I have in this this collection that I downloaded here? So we don't have like a like up, down, left, right sprites, but we do have run and idle, and this appears to be a 6-frame animation for like a walk animation or something like that. So how about instead of what I'm doing now, let me rename this to run-sheet to, underscore strip 6, because we want this to import into GameMaker with 6 sprite frames. I'm going to... This appears to be a bigger sprite for some reason. I don't know why this is 64 by 64. I don't think this guy is ever actually like exceeding the 32 by 32 bounds. Anyway, let me rename this to SPR character run. And we can once again set our sprite origin to our bottom center like this. And let's say 30 frames per second. Let's set that to 6 frames per second. If I run this, that might actually be a little bit slow. Maybe now I'll go 10. Alright, that looks better. That's going to be our run speed, or our run animation speed anyway. So now, let me do a few things. I'm going to not set my image speed to 0, so I'm just going to let this guy animate. I'm going to delete the code where I mess with the image speed. I'm going to leave the image X scale and Y scale alone, because I still want it to be like sized and flipped based on the circumstances. I'm going to get rid of this code where I changed your sprite to the smiley face, because I don't really need that anymore. And I can say sprite index equals SPR character run if we're moving, basically in place of setting the animation speed to 1. And now when I run the game, we will start off doing this idle animation, but if I start moving, we are going to run, we're going to walk, change to our walking animation, left, right. We don't have up or down, but if I had a different character sprite for like running up, running down, something like that, you could change it out. Once again, this will not actually reset your sprite to the idle sprite if you stop moving, and there's a couple different ways you can do that. You can say sprite index equals SPR character as sort of a default if you're not moving, like this. Alright, that'll get the job done. You can also... GameMaker doesn't have a explicit built-in variable that will tell you if your character has moved this frame or not, but it does have 2 variables, x previous and y previous, which will contain the position of the sprite in the previous frame. And this can be useful to check against if you want to see if your character has moved. So if you want to say something like if x is not equal to x previous, or... And you can combine 2 expressions with a with an or with the broken pipe symbol like that, or you could just type out the word or y is not equal to y previous. Then we can say sprite index equals SPR character. And this is often what I end up doing if I want to check if an object has moved since the last frame. Again, it looks kind of too simplistic to actually work in like a full-on proper game, but honestly it does most of the time, unless you're doing something really weird with movement. This is fine. So I'm just gonna go and run this, and this will do the same thing that it did before. Oh, you know what? That was a mistake. I wanted x equals x previous or y equals y previous. That should also be a and. There we go. So now if I'm moving around, we can animate. And if I stop moving around, we can stop animating. Up and down. All right, very nice. And there's a whole bunch of other ways that you can achieve the same logic if you'd like to do something else besides this for checking if the character has moved this frame. It's up to you. Is there anything else I'd like to really go over when it comes to sprite properties? So if you type image underscore in a GameMaker code editor window, you'll be greeted with all these other built-in variables which pertain to an instance of sprite. So image alpha and image blend over here, these pertain to the transparency and the tinting color that a sprite is going to be drawn with by default. Image number is going to pertain to the number of frames in a sprite. If you ever wanted to be able to just know how many frames your sprite index has. Image angle, I guess this could also be relevant. This is for rotation, so if you wanted to set image angle to some number, you could set that to 180 if you want your character to be rotated 180 degrees. I don't know what use that has, but if you want to do it, it's there. If you want to make your character like Spider-Man or something, I guess. And there's also a whole bunch of sprite-related built-in variables and functions for GameMaker. And aside from sprite index, we also have sprite height, sprite width, sprite x offset, and sprite y offset. And these are just variables which will contain like the size and like position of the sprite origin of the sprite that's currently assigned to an instance. As you can see from this tooltip, these are read-only variables, and you can't assign a number to them if you want to stretch out your sprite or anything like that. If you want to stretch out your sprite, you have to use something like image x scale or y scale. But it can occasionally be useful to know the dimensions of your sprite or the position of your sprite x offset. These will, by the way, take image x scale and image y scale into account. So if your sprite is 32 by 32, image width will be 32 multiplied by your image x scale. So in this case, it will contain 128. And this is again, sometimes useful information to know. Same thing for the sprite x offset, sprite y offset information for the sprite origins. And I think that is really all I want to do with sprites. So you can obviously do a lot of other things with sprites. You can draw them manually. You can get all kinds of other information about a sprite using some of these accessor functions, but I don't want this video to be like 5 hours long, so I'm gonna leave it there. So I think I'm gonna end this off here. My name is Michael. I like Wizards and Dragons and making games. So I like to post videos on stuff you can do in GameMaker, some basic beginner stuff like this, and some weird advanced 3D nonsense, shader nonsense. If you're interested in any of that, I would invite you to subscribe. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute to the channel, links to that can be found in all the usual places. You should all go check out Wizarducks and the Lost Hat, which is one of the games that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. Link to the Steam page can be found down below. I hope you all found that useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Zach Robinson, Squarecrow, Spy Games, Pixelated Pope, Mantaray, GameMaker, GameMart Indie, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, Brenton, and Bokeh for supporting these videos. If you want to contribute to the channel, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.